Thank you all for joining us for the National Center for Rural Road Safety's December webinar called Older Driver Safety. We're just going to give everyone a few seconds to join us and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for the National Center for Rural Road Safety's December webinar entitled Older Driver Safety. My name is Jamie Sullivan and I am the director of the center. I'm going to go ahead and give you all some logistics for our webinar today. Our webinar, as always, will be an hour and a half. We are recording this and it will be available on our website under the webinar archive at ruralsafetycenter.org. We do have closed captioning available for today's webinar. It has been emailed out to everybody. It also is in the chat pod currently and shown on your screen if you need to click on that. We will be stopping 3 times today for questions. You can use the question and answer pod over on the right-hand side to put any questions that you may have in, and you can do that at any time. When we do stop at those 3 periods, I will read those questions out to our presenters for today. Additionally, we do have a handout available for download over on the right-hand side. It is a PDF copy of today's presentation, and at the very end, you'll notice that we have about 4 slides of resources available. There are 2 additional resources that I did not include in there that I will include in the chat pod as soon as I'm done speaking and our first presenter gets started, so that you have all of those. Again, the resources that are available for older driver safety are all at the end of the PowerPoint presentation in that PDF of the handout. So please download if you're interested in those resources. We'd also ask if you could please complete the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. It will also be emailed out to you. Most importantly, we are starting to schedule our 2023 webinar series, and we'd love to hear from you what topics you would like us to address. There is a question at the end of that survey that has that, so we'll be going through all of the surveys to start selecting those 2023 topics. Additionally, certificates of completion will come out several weeks after today's webinar and will be emailed to you from our events at ruralsafetycenter.org email address, along with an application for you to apply for CEUs through Montana State University. Just as a reminder, the CEUs themselves are free to apply for. If you would like a formal transcript from the university, however, that is what costs $25. Additionally, you do not need to provide your entire Social Security number in that form, just the last 4 digits so that they can assign it to you and be able to find those certificates of completion when you are looking for them. We will have 3 presenters today, and I'm very excited to have all 3 of them here with us to celebrate Older Driver Safety Awareness Week. We did ask you guys ahead of time what you're looking to get out of today's webinar, and I'm excited to say that they are addressing quite a few things that you guys are looking for. Today, Kathy from NHTSA will be talking about support older drivers need, how to keep older drivers safe while keeping them independent, and understanding some of the common behavioral issues. Kimberly Schwind, who will be from AAA, will be talking about some of the resources for older driver education, how to focus on older driver as a program area, and also as an emphasis area in some of our plans. And lastly, Mark will round out our webinar today to talk about the infrastructure side of older driver safety. And he's going to be talking about how to incorporate some of the older driver behavior into infrastructure planning and how to create an infrastructure suited for aging population. So we're very excited to have all 3 of them here with us today. Our goal for the webinar is once you've completed this, you'll have an understanding of older driver safety in celebration of Older Driver Safety Awareness Week, which is going on right now. Our learning outcomes for today's webinar are to understand older driver crash risk, to describe the effects of age and age-related changes in functional abilities on driving performance and driving habits, to describe steps Ohio is taking through its strategic highway safety plan to keep older road users safe and mobile, to list infrastructure supporting older driver safety from the FHWA publication, Handbook for Designing Roadways for an Aging Population, and finally, to identify older road user safety resources. And once again, you can find that list of resources that we have available for you at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, and a PDF of that can be downloaded in the handouts pod over to the right-hand side. And 2 additional resources I will be putting into that chat pod here in just a few seconds. So our first presenter today is Kathy Sifrit. She is a research psychologist in the Injury Prevention Research Division of NHTSA's Office of Behavioral Safety Research. She received a PhD in Human Factors Psychology, specializing in older driver safety from Wichita State University in 2005, and has been with NHTSA since 2006. Since arriving at NHTSA, Dr. Sifrit's primary focus has been older driver safety, including older adults' interactions with vehicle automation. And at this point, I'm very excited to turn over our presentation to Kathy. And Kathy, at this time, you should have control of the mouse.
I just managed to unmute myself, and we'll see if the mouse, it doesn't look like the slide is advancing.
Okay, go ahead and try one more time.
Okay. Oh, that looks like it may have. Good deal.
Perfect.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for allowing us some time to discuss older driver safety. I'm going to talk a bit about NHTSA's work in the area of older driver safety. At NHTSA, we began to look at any topic with data, generally crash data, plus other information relevant to the topic. So for older drivers, we supplement crash data with research findings regarding functional aging to try to understand the physiological, cognitive, or other changes associated with normal aging that may affect driving. Then we collect and analyze on-road data to see if the theory-based hypotheses hold up in real-world driving. Once we understand how older adults manage the driving task and what elements of driving pose risks for older drivers, we work with our colleagues in NHTSA's program office to develop and test countermeasures to support older drivers' mobility while limiting the risk they pose to themselves and other road users. So first, I'll review some fatal crash data on older drivers, describe how age-related changes might affect driver behaviors, and then talk about a research project designed to help identify skill decrements that can increase older drivers' crash risk. NHTSA's National Center for Statistics and Analysis puts out a series of reports every year on various topics, including traffic safety for the older population, which they've defined as 65 and older. A substantial number of people, of older people, may have driven less than usual in 2020 to avoid exposure to COVID. So the crash data for 2020 differs substantially from previous years. However, across years, older adults are actually underrepresented in proportion of drivers in fatal crashes as compared to their proportion of the population. In 2019, older adults comprised 16% of the population, but only 15% of drivers in fatal crashes. In 2020, the figures were 17% of the population and only 13% of drivers in fatal crashes. And the remaining data points here for both years demonstrate that moving around is riskier for older adults than for their younger counterparts, as older people were overrepresented in 2019 in terms of all traffic fatalities, and in both years for vehicle occupant and pedestrian fatalities. So what explains this? Well, with increasing age, tissues that once flexed, think of garden hoses, now shear, as would a clay pipe. Bone density declines, so bones break more easily, and the angle of the rib cage becomes more flat and provides less protection for organs. And the brain loses volume. This begins, I'm sorry, but when people are in their 30s and 40s and accelerates in 60s and beyond. So aside from the cognitive effects of this change, the smaller brain takes up less space inside the skull, allowing the brain to repeatedly hit the skull in the event of a crash. So the bottom line is that older bodies respond poorly to crashes. Identifying and either working with unsafe older drivers to improve their skills, to limit their driving contexts to areas they can manage, or helping them find ways to get around that don't include driving can reduce risk for older adults and for all road users. So this figure, again, shows some substantial changes in fatality rates for different age groups for 2020 as compared to 2019. That's 2019 is where that vertical black line is. And while fatality rates for those younger than 65, the light blue line, increased from 2019 to 2020, rates for those 65 and up decreased, with substantial decreases among the oldest groups. Again, this is probably the effect of the pandemic. So for the next slides, I'm going to use the 2019 data to avoid pandemic-related effects in the 2020 data. Okay, so let's see. Here we have driver fatal crash involvement rates per 100,000 drivers. The light gray line is the rate for all drivers 15 and older. And as you can see, rates decline for women beginning around age 21 and for men beginning around age 25. The rate for men 65 plus is 24.5, and it's the lowest of any for these age groups. The rate for women of the same age is just over 9, which falls between rates for women 45 to 54 and 55 to 64. But combining ages 65 and older combines people who don't yet experience effects of age-related changes with those experiencing substantial effects. So let's break it down a little bit further. Driver involvement rates per 100,000 drivers for fatal crashes among those 65 and older. I've added this heavy black line. It's 21.73. That's the average crashes per fatal crashes per 100,000 drivers across all age groups. For men, rates of fatal crash involvement increased from age 70 to about age 80 when they flattened out around 30 per 100,000 licensed drivers. This is lower than the rate for men 45 to 64. Similarly, for women, rates increased from age 65 to age 80 when they leveled off around 12 per 100,000 drivers. This is similar to the rate for women in their 30s. So what underlies these numbers? Well, functional changes that can undermine older drivers' safety don't tend to affect driving until people in their 70s and 80s. In addition, many of the oldest drivers are retired or changed their activity level such that they travel less than they did when they were younger. So if they're not driving, they're not crashing. Further, people often avoid driving under conditions where they just feel uncomfortable. An example is nighttime driving, which anecdotal evidence indicates some people begin to avoid in middle adulthood. So with increasing age, people may avoid situations that carry added risks, such as long trips, driving in poor weather or unfamiliar areas, because they're just not comfortable. Now, the difficulty with this avoidance thing is that it can lead to isolation, particularly for those in rural areas who have limited mobility options. So with the increasing age, balancing mobility needs and the risk posed by driving becomes more difficult. Research has highlighted factors that put older drivers at risk and some countermeasures that may keep older drivers on the road while limiting the risk they pose to themselves and others. First, we know what does not predict crash risk. That's age. People age at different rates, so measures of functional abilities are better predictors than age of crash risk. People who begin to experience difficulty doing things like managing their finances, completing household chores, or who begin to get lost. Now, this is for people for whom this is a change, not those who have always found such tasks difficult. They may also have elevated crash risk. They may benefit from medical and vision exams, reviews of their medications, and possibly a driving evaluation or driving rehab work. Factors such as mobility needs paired with limited travel options affect risk. Someone who can't get to where they need to go without driving, even though they know they're not a safe driver, is likely to drive. And then there are personality factors, things like risk tolerance and overconfidence that can play a role. And despite age not predicting risk, a number of age-related factors can increase risk. Aging eyes are vulnerable to conditions like cataracts, which impairs contrast sensitivity, making it hard to see, for example, a pedestrian wearing dark clothes in the evening. And glare can be a problem, too, for people with cataracts. Glaucoma impairs peripheral vision, making a driver unaware of hazards that are away from the central visual area. And macular degeneration limits central vision, so it can impair a driver's ability to see what's straight ahead. Then there are cognitive changes associated with normal aging. And I'm not talking about dementia here, just normal aging, that can make it difficult for a driver to keep track of all the moving parts of the driving environment. Driving is complex. A driver has to be able to read the driving context, predict movements of other drivers, and navigate safely toward a destination. And this is particularly difficult in heavy traffic or in poor weather at night on high-speed roadways, which require faster decisions. And of course, dementia exacerbates these difficulties. And finally, as I said earlier, as people age, they become more fragile, so more likely to become injured as a result of a crash, and frail, less likely to recover fully from crash injuries. Then there's countermeasures. NHTSA puts out a volume entitled Countermeasures That Work, with evidence-based findings on ways to reduce crashes. Chapter 7 focuses on older drivers. Effective programs listed in Countermeasures That Work include, and these interact, so in no particular order, driver screening and testing, and states can do this differently. Some states require more frequent license renewal over a given age, like 70, 75, or 80. State office staff, licensing office staff may be trained to recognize behaviors that indicate a driver of any age may pose a risk and refer them for further screening and testing. And law enforcement officers, medical care providers, family, friends, or others may refer a driver if they have concerns about their competence, resulting in the state reviewing medical records, crash citation records, and perhaps requiring a driving test or taking some other action to determine whether a person poses a crash risk. Some states require referrals from medical personnel when a driver is either diagnosed with a medical condition or begins a medication that may impair their driving. Again, this varies by state. And most states allow for license restrictions, and these can be particularly useful for rural areas with few mobility options. If a state deems a driver unsafe, they may offer the driver the option of a restriction to something like no high-speed roadways or to specific familiar destinations. And these restrictions are usually tailored to both the driver's mobility needs and their driving capabilities. And this can allow the driver the mobility they need while limiting the risk they pose to themselves and others. So these next few slides cover findings from a study, older driver performance across 6 naturalistic studies that looked at ways age-related functional changes may affect drivers, and the extent to which people with compromised functional or driving skills limit their driving exposure, where, when, and how much they drive. This work also looked at data from the Strategic Highway Research Program 2, or SHARP-2 NDS, Naturalistic Driving Study, that included the same measures. So a number of studies have shown unexpectedly weak or no relationships between functional and driving measures. We wanted to see if the relationships were really weak or if this finding just resulted from sample sizes too small to detect the relationships. The combined NHTSA studies each had relatively small sample sizes and short data collection intervals. So we also looked at a set of SHARP-2 data on older drivers that had a much larger sample and involved a longer data collection period, so had more events. These data allowed researchers to get at the basis of persistent findings that functional changes that are logically associated with drivers' crash risk consistently show, at best, weak relationships. So the study explored relationships between functional measures and how much people drive and what proportion of their driving they spend under high demand conditions, such as high speed, limited access roadways at night or during rush hour. The SHARP-2 data set had more than 8 times as many participants as the NHTSA set, also a data collection interval of 1 to 2 years as compared to the NHTSA interval of up to a month. So the SHARP-2 data had far more trips, hours, and miles of driving. Oh, and my numbering changed. I think that they're the same though, sorry. The studies included in the NHTSA data set looked at older drivers in terms of restriction compliance, effects of various conditions on driving, and older drivers' self-regulation and exposure. Both NHTSA and SHARP-2 data included trail making test and maze test, which are measures of cognition, a rapid paced walk, which is a standard physical measure, and then the exposure measures included trip counts and duration and trips at different times of day and under various conditions. Only the NHTSA data had a driver performance measure, which was total time or total points off on a ROSE test. And we used details from the SHARP-2 data, crash and near crash data for some exploratory analyses. People often ask me what the COG tests look like, so I included this slide. Trail making test A, which isn't shown, is like a kid's dot to dot. You simply go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Trail making test B is harder. You go from 1 to A to 2 to B to 3 to C, which isn't too bad, but when you get up to 10 and 11, it starts to get harder to remember which letter goes next. The mazes look like the things we all did as kids with paper and pencil. They had to be completed quickly, which made them difficult. And the findings from the NHTSA data set showed correlations in the expected direction, but as in previous work, they were very weak, with a few exceptions which were weak. The strongest, but still weak, relationships included that people with poor road test scores had poor Trails B scores. Older people drove fewer minutes per day. Those with poor Trails A scores drove more slowly. And then the key finding here is that the correlation between age and road test score was 0.1, which is almost nothing. This shows what researchers and clinicians have been saying for years, that age does not predict driving ability. And the SHARP-2 findings were similar, with correlations in the expected direction, but very weak to weak. So we wanted to better understand these relationships. So we conducted, as I said earlier, some exploratory analysis looking at data for drivers with and without cognitive deficits. So we looked at relationships between those with normal and impaired cognitive status with the time they took to begin to respond to a driving hazard. So cognitive impairment was defined using scores that are common in both the literature and clinical practice. So these drivers were not diagnosed with dementia, but did perform poorly, more poorly than the norm on some tests. We looked at the interval from the time a hazard emerged while driving until the driver began to respond to it by, for instance, releasing the accelerator. And again, we found no statistically significant differences. So we narrowed the subset of events we looked at. We focused on events with hard to detect hazards, which should be especially hard for participants with cognitive impairments. Such impairments can compromise attention to objects in the periphery. People tend to focus straight ahead when things get cognitively difficult. So we limited events to those where the emerging threat was peripheral rather than focal. Some examples of peripheral events are things like a deer approaching the road, a car backing from a driveway, or approaching an intersection. Focal events would be a deer or object in the road or a slower vehicle in the lane ahead. So looking at the 280 instances where hazards originated in the periphery, we found that drivers with cognitive impairment took nearly 1/3 of a second longer to initiate a response. So in order to find that difference that logic said should be here, we had to look at the most difficult events. And at 30 miles an hour, a car travels about 13 feet in this 1/3 of a second. This is a speed common in suburban areas where drivers are likely to encounter pedestrians, including children, people walking pets, as well as cyclists, including young and inexperienced ones. This difference of 1/3 of a second is not only statistically significant, but could be meaningful in terms of risk. So overall, this study found that correlations between functional measures and measures of driver performance and exposure were at best weak, although in the expected direction. Thus, with age, people experience declines in skills that underlie driving. These changes vary in type and severity, and most people seem to understand their limits and properly limit their driving to contexts where they feel confident. Older adults' driving decisions may hinge more on their habits and their mobility needs than their driving ability. And even people with some level of impairment may drive safely under relatively simple conditions, such as familiar areas, with low speeds that allow for slower reaction times. And this supports that idea of providing restricted licenses. The findings from the NHTSA data obtained from small sample and short observation periods were remarkably consistent with those from the analysis of the much larger SHARP2 data set. This suggests that even relatively brief and inexpensive naturalistic data of driving behavior has validity, but the larger SHARP2 data set was necessary to hone in on the relationship between cognitive limitations and the hazards originating in the periphery. And I believe that is my last slide.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kathy. And we do have some questions that came in for you while you were speaking as well.
Okay.
So the very first one is that the person feels that states are going in the wrong direction for license renewal. They are allowing both online renewal up until 70 years of age, as well as lengthening the period between the renewal. So in some cases, 6 or 8 years, even if you're 70 plus. There's
Right.
no retesting requirement, which is a big issue. So they're wondering if there's any correlation between length between the renewal and crash data.
Ooh, interesting question. I don't know of any data on that. I would keep in mind that up to about age 70, 75, somewhere in there, depending on what kind of data you're looking at, drivers, those are among the safest drivers on the road. It's after that the risk tends to increase. But yeah, I can see that the longer intervals and the online renewal might be problematic. I have no data, so I can't really answer. I can't answer that question at this time.
And then when we did our questions or our registrations at the beginning, we also had some people submit questions there. So I have a few for you that we're going to go through right now.
Right.
Although you didn't talk about safety technology, I know that none of our other presenters are going to do that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit of safety technology for older drivers or the use of driver assisted technologies.
Okay, I need to sort out the question a little bit. Are you talking about, we've long had adaptive equipment, which, for example, allows drivers with something like peripheral neuropathy that makes it so they don't have the sensation they need in their feet to handle the brake and accelerator safely, to use hand controls instead. There are a lot of stuff out there. NHTSA recommends, if you use those kinds of things, to work with a driver rehabilitation specialist in order to make sure you have the equipment you need, it's installed properly, and you're properly trained to use it. People using such equipment without training show up in the fatality data every now and then. If you're talking about some of the newer driver assist technologies, they're so new, we again don't have any data. And working for NHTSA, I can have opinions about what works, but I can't talk about them unless I have some data to back me up.
Understood, and we appreciate you addressing that question. And I think there's some great things out there and some additional research that could be done, right? So hopefully that will be coming soon.
That's my home. We did have some data on, this is kind of now old technology, but we found that people who used a GPS to get to an unfamiliar location were much safer than people who used a map and turn-by-turn directions that were printed on paper. So I think a lot of people have already moved from the paper to the GPS, the navigation aids, and those have shown us, we've found in a small study, a safety effect there.
I believe there's also a study that came out about that older drivers tend to hold on to their cars a little bit longer as well than the rest of the population, which could also impact having some of those safety features that are starting to come out, some of the newer safety features as well.
Right, the newer safety features plus the just the extent to which that vehicle protects you. So the cars are getting much better at keeping you from having a bad outcome in the event of a crash.
So one additional question for you, and then we're going to have Kimberly talk a little bit about what they've done in Ohio. And that question is, what considerations need to be given to older drivers for their safety and specifically other road users? So not just drivers, but the pedestrians and cyclists who may be older as well.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me start with cyclists. They're going to, they're probably in better physical condition, so probably better functionally than some of the pedestrians, just because they have to be able to keep that bike balanced and moving. But still, the reaction times are going to be slower. And so if there are, if there are ways to separate the bicyclist from the vehicle traffic, that's going to be helpful. There can, then be difficulties if you mix bicyclists with pedestrians. But the bicyclists, I think the primary need from them is simply to have, give them response time. So, spacing from, separation from vehicles. And for both pedestrians and cyclists, they're at risk at intersections when they're crossing vehicle traffic. So they'll need, older pedestrians need those walk cycles to be long enough for them to get across the street. And I may be getting into at the last presenter's area here, talking about infrastructure pieces. And also things like vehicles turning, right turns on red. A lot of times a driver turning right on a red light may check for oncoming traffic and the light status and make sure all those things aren't changing, and may miss that older pedestrian or cyclist beginning to cross the street. So it's possible that something like a light cycle that is pedestrians and cyclists only with no right turns on red is the safest or the easiest way to protect them. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you. I appreciate you going through that.
Good. That's not generally one I address, so I had to kind of think about it.
So next up, we are going to have Kimberly Schwinn. So thank you, Kathy, for answering all those questions for us. Kimberly is the Director of Public Affairs for the AAA Ohio Auto Club. She directs the media relations, traffic safety, driver education, and government affairs activity at the club. She's passionate about traffic. She's a passionate traffic safety advocate who serves on the Ohio Traffic Safety Council, the Strategic Highway Safety Plan Steering Committee, and is the team lead for the Strategic Highway Safety Plan's older road user emphasis area. She strives to partner AAA's expertise and organizations throughout Ohio to prevent crashes and reduce the number of deaths and serious injuries on Ohio's roads. Before joining AAA in 2010, she worked as a reporter and a meteorologist, and she has also held on-air positions. She's earned a BA in journalism and mass communications from Miami University in 2005 and a BS in atmospheric science from the Ohio State University in 2007. And I'm excited to have Kimberly talk about what they're doing in Ohio.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. It's definitely been a long journey here in Ohio, and we still have a long way to go, but I'm excited to share with you some of our victories and where we're headed. Here's a brief overview of what we're going to talk about here in the next 20 minutes or so. We're going to look at some crash trends. We're going to also take a look at our action plan, what we've completed, what's in progress or up next. And I'll try to talk about how maybe you could incorporate some of this into your states and your efforts as well. So to kind of give an overview of what is this older road user emphasis area, I'm not sure how many of you are part of your state strategic highway safety plan, but here in Ohio, it's a multi-agency plan. It's used to reduce traffic fatalities and serious injuries on our public roadways, so that's our main goal. And every state does have a strategic highway safety plan, which is required by federal law. In Ohio, the Ohio Department of Transportation oversees the plan, and there's a multi-agency steering committee that contributes to that. I serve on that on behalf of AAA. And then what's identified in this plan is eligible for funding. So a lot of the funding on what we're talking about here comes from federal dollars through the Strategic Highway Safety Plan. And so this is a 5-year plan. So our 5-year period is 2021 to 2025. So we're kind of right in the middle of this. And what's interesting is that I was appointed as the head of the older road user emphasis area, and we started planning in March of 2020. So we have done almost this entire thing virtually. All of our meetings, everything has been done virtually. We had our first in-person, which was a hybrid meeting last Friday. So it's just been absolutely incredible to see everybody come together. And we have a long way to go in this 5-year plan, a lot of things that we want to accomplish. So we use data to identify our safety priorities, and I'll get into just a little bit of an overview of that data. The plan's multidisciplinary, and it really helps us to collaborate. So I think we have a really great group that does a lot of collaboration here in Ohio. And so here's just a breakdown of the different emphasis areas and kind of who leads each of the emphasis areas. And what's unique about the older road user emphasis area is it is led by AAA. So I'm the only one from an outside organization that's not part of the state that is running an emphasis area for the state strategic highway safety plan. And I know that AAA is involved in a lot of different emphasis areas and strategic highway safety plans across the country. So, if you are interested in reaching out to AAA, definitely reach out to your local club representative. They can help you, and we have reps across the country that can help. I'm just based here in Ohio, in Central Ohio. So when we look at our older road user emphasis area, we separate this into 4 subcommittees that really are all intertwined, even though there's specific focuses and action plans for each subcommittee. We have the education subcommittee, which is really kind of the overarching umbrella subcommittee, getting the word out about what everybody's doing, and then also having some programmatic action items as well. There's the active alternative transportation subcommittee, medically at-risk driver subcommittee, and the infrastructure subcommittee. So what does everybody do? Well, we're going to take a look at see some of the accomplishments here in just a minute, but I want to get into, these are some of the crash trends that were just presented at our meeting on December 2nd. And so when we take a look at this crash data between 2017 and 2021, older road user crashes made up 17% of all crashes in Ohio, and they make up 22% of total fatalities and 18% of serious injuries. So as we look at the statewide fatalities and serious injuries, so this is all drivers. You can see the trend here in Ohio. Things were trending downward in terms of serious injuries, and not so much with the fatalities, unfortunately. We saw a spike in 2021, and then this is year-to-date 2022, so not finalized data by any means. So I don't know if you can necessarily say it's trending downward, maybe a little bit, but obviously that's not finalized yet. As we take a look at the older road user serious injuries and fatalities, you can see that there's a similar trend to the overall statewide fatalities and serious injuries. We saw that spike in 2021, and in fact that 299 older road user fatalities in 2021 was a 10-year high. So that's not something that we like to see. So we're down a little bit as of right now in 2022, but again, the year is not over. So we want to talk about kind of where are these crashes happening, and we're seeing about 50-50 state and local systems. So they're not all on the highways, they're not all on the local roadways. It is about 50-50. But when we look at the functional class of roadways, arterial roadways, which are typically speed limits between 45 and 55 in urban areas near freeways, we see more crashes on those. And so when we look at the key data points, again, we're seeing most fatalities involving older road users on those arterial roadways, followed by the collectors. And so what are collectors? Well, those are defined as roads that move traffic from those arterials to the local roadways. So traffic speeds are typically between 25 and 45 miles an hour on those collector roads. So the arterials and the collectors are our biggest problem roadways for older drivers in the state of Ohio. So those are the roads that really basically range between 25 and 55 miles per hour. 62% of the fatalities are considered older drivers at fault. 50% of older road user involved crashes are considered at fault. So, 62% of the fatalities, 50% of the overall crashes are considered at fault for this age group. And then angle, head-on, and fixed object crashes are the most common types of crashes. So that's a little bit of an overview of our most recent data. Of course, we continue to revisit the data, make sure that we're still on track, make sure we're still looking at the right things and the right countermeasures. So looking into the education subcommittee and what's been going on here, excuse me. So the education subcommittee has updated and distributed more than 18,000 Stay Fit to Drive booklets, which are available upon request, and we need to print another run. These are booklets, they're about, I'd say maybe 15 pages long, and they have a lot of different resources for older drivers and their families, compiled by this group that we've had. Really, this emphasis area has been going on since 2016, and we have a diverse group from all different areas in older driver safety. And so we've compiled this booklet with a lot of different resources. Again, for older drivers and their families, they're in the BMVs. They're also, we send them to our Safe Communities coordinators to take out to community events. They are in senior centers, and so we continue to try to get those out as much as possible, because we've had feedback that a lot of people in this age group want paper. To supplement that, we also launched a landing page where we keep all of the resources. So you can download this guide on the landing page, and you can see an image of that landing page. It's transportation.ohio.gov/older drivers. And so this is really where we house all of our information that we want to share with older drivers and their families. And you'll hear me talk about that website a lot and refer to that as we get through the next few minutes. So we've also, we know in Ohio that we don't have all the answers. And so we've researched what other states are doing. And if you haven't checked out Florida's Safe Mobility for Life and Maryland, they are two really pillar states, I think, when it comes to older driver safety and what they're doing. And so we've researched, what are they doing? What are other states doing? What are some best practices? How can we implement that here in Ohio? And then we also recently did a statewide paid ad campaign. Our campaign in Ohio, you'll see that is the Stay Fit to Drive. So that's kind of our logo. That's what we're trying to tell people, is that Stay Fit to Drive. And how can I stay fit to drive? And what does that mean? And so that's our campaign and our messaging. And so we did that ad campaign throughout 2022, really focusing on senior media outlets. We also did some grassroots outreach. We were at the Ohio State Fair. There's some of our team. We had a break reaction timer there. There are the booklets on the table, really trying to get the word out about the different resources and what's going on with the state, trying to support older drivers. And then, the education subcommittee, as I mentioned, also supports the other subcommittees by creating resources and materials, most of which are on that landing page. So what are we doing next? Well, after doing that ad campaign, we want to do a survey to determine what's Ohioans' awareness of Stay Fit to Drive. So where are we now, so that we know where we need to go and how we need to move that needle to get the word out more. We also, something that we're starring is, we found out from that landing page and the ad campaign that people are paying attention, and they're calling us, with questions about, what do I do if I'm concerned about a loved one, or I'm concerned about a neighbor? What are the next steps? Where should I go? And so we really determined that we need to put some resources out there to guide people who are concerned about somebody's ability. What are those steps in Ohio? What do they need to do? And so that's something that's starred for early 2023. We're also going to continue to do outreach, Ohio State Fair, and expanding programs like CarFit. If those of you that haven't heard of CarFit, that is an amazing program. It's a program that was developed by AAA, AARP, and the American Occupational Therapy Association to try to, as you heard, Kathy talking about, the older drivers are more likely to be injured or killed if they're in a crash. So if we make simple adjustments, like their distance to the steering wheel, their line of sight over the steering wheel, how that seatbelt fits, where their head is positioned on the head restraint, we hope to reduce that crash or that risk of being injured if they are in a crash. And so CARFIT's a really great program. We want to work on expanding that, and then also expanding senior driver improvement courses that AAA offers, AARP offers throughout the state. So our active transportation subcommittee has really done a lot of work as well. So we really wanted to make sure that we understood, so where are our problem areas, right? So where are we seeing the most older driver crashes and fatalities? Where do we really need to focus our efforts? And so they conducted a hotspot analysis to compare that, and also to take a look at adult population density and then what transit services are available. So we want to keep people driving as safe as possible, as long as possible, but we understand that at some point, a lot of people are going to outlive their driving ability. In fact, the AAA Foundation has found that people are outliving their driving ability by 7 to 10 years. And so what happens then? And so we want to make sure that they're still able to get around. So where are places that we really need to focus on making sure that there are those, alternative transportation modes for people when it's time to give up the keys, where the problem areas there. And so we identified 4 counties to pilot different programs: Franklin, Delaware, Summit, and Clinton counties. And then we also created a Safe Routes to Age in Place toolkit. And so this is a program that was developed by the Age Friendly Innovation Center at The Ohio State University. And there's a toolkit, again, on that landing page if you want to check it out, so that you can replicate this program in different communities. And so a pilot was completed in Franklin County. And then as we move forward, what's really, really exciting is the Age Friendly Innovation Center received funding from Honda to replicate the Safe Routes to Age in Place in Franklin County. And then even though Union County wasn't one of our counties that we identified for a pilot, that's where Honda is located. And there's a village in Union County that we're going to focus another pilot of the Safe Routes to Age in Place in Union County. So we got funding to do that. And so, working on that as we get into 2023. So really exciting to see that being replicated using that toolkit, and hopefully we can expand that to other communities as well. So our medically at-risk subcommittee, we've reviewed, again, states' best practices. How do we work with these medically at-risk drivers? How do we, what information can we use in Ohio? We put that together in a report, and we're continuing to review that and see what measures can we take in Ohio. And I know I'm going really, really fast, so I know that there's a lot more information, but I really want to get into this a little bit. We also have worked with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office on implementing a program called DOSI. So DOSI is Driver Orientation Screen for Cognitive Impairment. And it was developed in California by TREDS, and it is an amazing program. It's a tool to help law enforcement identify drivers with cognitive impairments after drugs and alcohol have been ruled out. And so you can see here, I know it's really small on your screen, but there's certain questions that the law enforcement officer would ask the person, and then based on the answers, you get a score, and it explains kind of what are the next steps. So helping to identify these cognitively impaired drivers. And so this is something that we are working. Franklin County is where Columbus, Ohio is based. And so that's, the center of Ohio. So we're working with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. We are really, really wanting to expand this throughout the state. Another thing that the medically at-risk subcommittee has done is created resources. A lot of those are in the Stay Fit to Drive booklet that support a driver's ability to drive safely. And so you can see, one of these things is this driver safety self-assessment checklist. We really are pushing the certified driver rehabilitation specialist. So things that people might need to know. We're also working on an online physician referral letter that would open a medical case file. So what in Ohio right now, if a physician is concerned about somebody's driving ability, they have to write a letter to the BMV to open a case on that person, a medical case. And so right now there's really no template. The physician kind of has to do that on their own. And so we're trying to make it easier for them, create a template, and then working with the BMV, hopefully to get this available on their website so that it's easily accessible for physicians. And so a lot going on with this subcommittee, again, working to post that letter, working to expand DOSI, create more resources for families, and then also working to develop a distribution list for multiple channels. You know, we're talking about elder care law, we're talking about, you know, physicians, and how do we get this material to everybody. So that's something we're going to be working on as well. So for infrastructure, during our planning, there was questions about, you know, what kind of interchanges are most dangerous for older drivers? You know, should we be, when we're working on planning, should we be looking at certain interchange designs, and should we be educating people on how to navigate certain interchanges? And so we researched this. We had the Ohio Department of Transportation did some research on the impacts of freeway interchange design on older driver crashes, and we created this fact sheet, which we will be posting on that landing page as well, to kind of explain what are the most dangerous interchanges for older drivers, and then some tips on how do you navigate them safely. Continuing in the infrastructure subcommittee, through the Ohio Department of Transportation, to make walking and bicycling safer for older road users. Some of those things that Kathy went over, and I know that Mark's going to go over as well. We've updated documentation on implementing leading pedestrian intervals. And then Mark actually did a course for us that hosted the FHWA Designing and Operating Streets for an Aging Population back in April. And so that was well received, and it looks like as we move forward, surprise, Mark, we would like to talk about hosting more of these courses, and really continuing to get the word out to local planners. And then we also, you know, want to continue funding projects that make the road safer for older road users. So I know that was a lot, and that was really, really quick. So does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much. That was a lot of information, but it was a lot of really good, useful information that everyone is going to be able to use. So we do have a question that came in for you, and it says, is the Franklin County Sheriff's Office the only law enforcement agency using the DOSI app in Ohio?
So we worked with Stark County as well. So they did a pilot program for us. Right now, that's all that we know about. We're hoping to, in 2023, like I said, really focus on getting the word out to other law enforcement agencies. What we've been struggling with is data collection, and how do we collect data. In California, they have an app, which they said that we could use, but it has California law in the app, so we would need to create our own app. And so we decided that we wanted to get more support for the program before we, and see how they would like the data collected. Is it through an app? Because, you know, or is it something else that would be better for our law enforcement in Ohio? And so we really wanted to get support for the program and then work with them on that data collection. And so that's kind of where we are with the program right now.
And then another question that came in for you is, are there trends downward during the winter months because of snowbirding?
That's a really good question, and I am not sure about that. That's something definitely that we could look into. I mean, yes, you know, people there are snowbirds for sure going to Florida, to Arizona, other warm weather spots, but you also have to think of, you know, in the winter it gets darker earlier. We know that driving in the dark is much more difficult, especially as you age, because you need more light, you know, to be able to see properly. And so we also have a lot more driving in the dark. We also have snow So it would be interesting to see if the fact that some people leave does impact the crash data, but again, it's counteracted by the other conditions that I mentioned. So definitely something to look into.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for your presentation and for answering all of the questions that came in.
Thank
So
you.
now we're gonna move forward to our final speaker, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the infrastructure side of the house. And so we have Mark Doctor, who is a senior safety and geometric design engineer and team leader with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center. Mark provides technical services and training on deploying innovative and flexible design and safety practices on a national level. He is part of a working group within FHWA trying to raise national awareness of the safe system approach and advance the implementation of applying safe system principles more broadly within the U.S. So I'm excited to turn this over now to Mark. Dana, it does look like Mark may be muted on our side. Would you be able to take a look at that, please?
All right, thank you, Dana. Yeah, appreciate that. Hopefully you can hear me now. So thank you. I'm really glad to be part of this webinar, and great that we're recognizing Older Driver Safety Awareness Week. And thank you, Kathy and Kimberly, for great presentations. Really interesting stuff. So I'm sort of wrapping it up, batting cleanup here, and I'm going to talk about the infrastructure side of things. And what I'm going to focus on is the content that comes from the Federal Highway Administration's older or handbook for designing roadways for the aging population. We're currently on our third edition of this publication. The first edition came out in 1998, and even at that time, the importance of designing and operating our streets and roads for the aging population was well recognized, and research was conducted to look at what types of roadway safety and design and operational features had a particular benefit to older users, and not just older drivers, but also older pedestrians and bicyclists as well. And so a second edition, and then the most recent third edition draws upon some of the newer research since the first edition came out, and also looking at what we call promising practices. So things that may not have definitive research that shows a benefit specifically to the aging population, but certainly things that show a benefit to all users, and most likely an additional benefit to the aging population. So this handbook is available for free. It's available on our Federal Highway Administration safety webpage. We've got the address here, and the full handbook includes information about the underlying research, and it provides summaries of the original underlying research in the back of the handbook. But for those that just want to focus on the recommendations, the safety countermeasures, we have a companion document called the desk reference of the handbook, and it's an abridged, easier to use for practitioner publication. So the FHWA handbook, and right up front in the forward of the handbook, it states the purpose, and it really is for practitioners, even though there's a lot of good information about research that was done to demonstrate the effectiveness of these strategies. That the handbook itself is intended for a transportation practitioner audience, and it's intended to provide practical information and provide that background for those that want to dig deeper. But the handbook in particular dives right into to the key things that transportation practitioners really should know and understand as we try to design and operate for an aging population. So the handbook is divided into different chapters depending upon the type of roadway facility that we're dealing with. There's a chapter specific to intersections, at grade intersections. There's a chapter on freeway interchanges, chapter on roadway segments, one on construction zones or work zones, and then a small chapter on at grade highway rail crossings. So in total, there are 33 proven practices and 18 promising practices. The difference being a proven practice has the science behind it, the research to demonstrate a benefit, a specific benefit to older users. Now, I do want to say that in reality, all of the practices benefit all users. So it's not that there's anything specific in the handbook that is beneficial only to the aging population. Really, everything in there benefits all users. The difference being that the recommendations in the handbook have a demonstrated enhanced benefit, safety benefit to the older population. So of these 51 practices that are contained in the handbook, there are also some recommendations or sub-recommendations within each practice. Some practices may have multiple recommendations. So in total, there's 150 recommendations contained in the handbook, broken down by these categories. And I'm not going to go through all 150 recommendations or the 51 practices, but I will give you a glimpse into what's contained in here. So starting with chapter 2, which focuses on intersections, because 24 of the 51 practices involve intersections, and you can see some of them listed here, the proven practices and the promising practices. Intersections are particularly challenging to older drivers. We've seen a lot of the research so far, but I want to present a little bit more data specific to intersections. And we see that multi-vehicle crashes and intersections account for about 37% of the fatal crashes with involvement of drivers 80 and above. Now compare that to about 19% for drivers ages 16 through 59. Now there's a couple of reasons for this. Well, first of all, intersections can be challenging for drivers of any age. There's a lot of decisions that need to be made at intersections. Judgments in gaps of traffic, judgments in speed, looking for not only conflicting vehicles, but conflicting other users, making sure that that there are no pedestrians in the crosswalk, or making sure we don't have cyclists, perhaps as we're making a right turn at an intersection. So there's a lot going on at intersections that really require us to be observant, engaged, and use our senses, especially a sight. Having a wide angle of view is helpful, and many of these are challenges or diminished abilities that we face as we age, and so it becomes challenging for older drivers in particular. And at intersections, when a crash does occur, intersection crashes tend to have a higher severity distribution. In other words, crashes at intersections generally are severe, not just because of speeds, but also because of impact angles. If we think of things like red light running, or going through a stop sign, or making a left turn where we perhaps the gap in oncoming traffic was misjudged. And if a collision occurs where a vehicle collides with another vehicle and the collision hits the vehicle doors, either the driver's side door or the passenger side door, our cars give us less protection on the sides. We have more protection with crumple zones in the front of the vehicle, in the rear of the vehicle, less so on the sides. And so at intersections, the kinetic energy of the crashes tend to be higher. And so as we age, our ability to absorb those collision forces or to recover from injuries sustained during those collisions becomes more challenging. So intersections are a particular challenge for older drivers. And there are certain maneuvers that are challenging as well. Making judgments. So for example, making a left turn at a permissive left turn signalized intersection, or at a stop controlled intersection where the say the major street does not stop. So having to judge for gaps and making judgments about approach speeds, all of those are challenging. And so we see the data showing that as we age, those abilities tend to decline. So some of the proven practices with regard to intersections, roundabouts. We know the proven safety benefits of roundabouts, but for an older driver in particular, roundabouts, it breaks up the decision points. So a roundabout, if you think about it, is essentially a right in, right out type of intersection. The left turn movement, in other words, is made by just judging for a gap, and roundabouts tend to slow traffic down. So it makes it easier to judge for gaps. And we don't have the left turn T-bone type of crashes at roundabouts. If a collision does occur at a roundabout, not only is one vehicle, the vehicle going around the circulating roadway, it tends to be slower because the geometry of the roundabout slows that vehicle down. But if a collision does occur, say between a driver that doesn't yield, a driver approaching the roundabout, and for whatever reason, either doesn't see the yield sign, doesn't understand the yield sign, and let's say they just blow on through it, and they do not yield, and if there's a collision with a vehicle in the circulating roadway, well, at least one of the vehicles is going slower, the vehicle in the circulating roadway, and the angle of impact, instead of it being a T-bone type crash, a 90-degree angle of impact, it's more likely to be about a 40-degree angle of collision. And that adjustment in the collision angle essentially reduces the transference of kinetic energy forces in the crash. So we know roundabouts are safer, and it's really because of the physics involved. Now, not all intersections are roundabouts. We have a lot of signalized intersections, and there are things that can be done at signalized intersections to also improve safety, especially for the older drivers. One of them is to go with protected only left turn signal phasing. And that would be the ability to make a left turn with the green arrow at a traffic signal. So with a green arrow, you're basically given the right of way to make the left turn, and compare that to a permissive left turn, whether that be on a green ball or a flashing yellow arrow. And that left turn maneuver requires the driver to make judgments in oncoming traffic. And so trying to judge that gap, the approach speed, and the distance of the approaching vehicle. So going with protected only left turn phasing, it has a safety benefit for all users, but in particular, the aging population. It's also safer for pedestrians. When we have the permissive left turn condition, we can have a pedestrian in the crosswalk that left turning vehicle would be crossing over. Pedestrian legally in the crosswalk. And while the driver's attention is focused on oncoming traffic, looking for that gap ahead, they may not see a pedestrian that's in the crosswalk. And so when they have a gap, especially if it's a tight gap to make a left turn, that they may just try to accelerate through. And if there is a pedestrian in the crosswalk, that can be a very tragic outcome. So it's really safer for all users to go protected only. If we do have permissive left turn conditions at signalized intersections, or if it's an uncontrolled, uncontrolled for the major street, maybe stop controlled for the minor street. But if the major street doesn't have a signal, doesn't have stop control, it's still a case where judgment has to be executed for gaps in oncoming traffic. And that's where offset left turn lanes can be very helpful. It allows drivers to see oncoming traffic without the vehicle in the opposing left turn lane blocking the view that a driver would have of oncoming traffic. So offset left turn lanes is another recommendation that that is contained in the handbook. And here's an example of left turn lane geometry with negative offset. So let's say this is a permissive left turn condition at a signalized intersection, and you have a flashing yellow arrow or green ball, and by the time you would see a vehicle coming at you in the through lane, because our view is blocked by that vehicle in the opposing left turn lane. So negative offset can be really challenging for drivers of any age, but in particular, older drivers. Also, design strategies at intersections like the channelization, the right turn channelization. And not only does modern designs for right turn channelization try to reduce turning speeds, which is a safety benefit for pedestrians in particular, but also from a older driver perspective, a modern design reduces the amount of neck turning that a driver would have to do to look for a gap as they're making a right turn, whether it's a stop condition or a right turn on red. We know that as we age, many people face challenges in their upper body mobility, the ability to turn our neck or to turn our shoulders. And so to reduce that look back angle, the angle at which we have to look back to see oncoming traffic, that can be challenging. And if we have a skewed intersection where that look back angle may be influenced by the skew of the intersection, well, sometimes strategies like a no right turn on red might be another example of something that could be done. So these are some examples of things that are in the handbook. It's both design oriented, operational oriented, and it also focuses a lot on signs and pavement markings. So as an example, a recommendation for curbs at intersections to have enhanced delineation so things like reflective markers or raised posts, especially for complex situations. And other practices besides intersections, so for example, for roadway segments, road diets is another example. So road diets is a proven safety countermeasure that FHWA promotes, but it has a particular benefit for older drivers as well. It simplifies. If we think about how the safety benefits of road diets are derived, it slows traffic. It simplifies decisions such as left turn movements and the ability to provide, say, a center two-way left turn lane as opposed to taking one of the through lanes and waiting for a gap in oncoming traffic to make a left turn where we're more susceptible perhaps to being rear-ended. It also separates user groups. Sometimes road diets are able to provide bicycle lanes where previously they did not exist. So the ability to separate, the ability to slow, and the ability to simplify certain decisions all contribute to the safety benefits of road diets. So I want to leave you with kind of this guiding tenet, and this is from Glenn Myler, the Director of Education and Research at the Canadian Urban Development Institute, who said, if you design for the young, you exclude the old. But if you design for the old, you include everyone. And it's so true. And it's so true with roadway design and operations. Just about every recommendation in the FHWA handbook benefits everybody. But in particular, it benefits the aging population in particular. So I encourage you to go look at the FHWA handbook. And one other thing that is in there that I haven't mentioned yet is some guidance on implementation. So it basically walks practitioners through a multi-step process of first determining, well, it goes through a series of questions, like if we are perhaps having a project in an area where we have a census tract population of higher older users, or if we are on an origin destination route, but between services or facilities that is likely to have more older user traffic. Those are examples of the guidance that is contained in the handbook as well. So with that, I think we've got a little time for questions.
We do.
So,
Thank you so much. Dana, I'm going to ask if you could please give me control of the mouse. And then, Mark, we did have a question come in for you, and that is that in the past, roundabouts were not popular with the public. Has this changed?
Good, loaded question. You know, it is, I guess it's good that I can laugh at it. Roundabouts certainly in many areas continues to be something that a lot of public opposition we still encounter. And even though roundabouts have been implemented in many parts of the country for decades now, that there's still that potential pushback. I think in areas where roundabouts are still new, you may see more public pushback. But even in areas where there are a lot of roundabouts, it still seems like that there's always folks that don't like them, and I can understand that. We tend to not like things that are perhaps different, things that are different from what we're used to. But no doubt, there's one thing that is certain, and that is the safety benefit. And so I think for us as transportation practitioners, the importance for us to communicate that key message that roundabouts are so much safer, especially when it comes to reductions in severe injuries and fatal crashes. It is true that sometimes we see an increase in total crashes when a roundabout is put in, but thankfully they are minor crashes. And so I think one of the challenges that we have as practitioners is being able to articulate how the trade-off of not having fatal and severe injury crashes, that benefit is so great that the trade-off perhaps of having more minor crashes is actually a very good trade-off. If you've probably heard a lot of the webinars that we've conducted on the safe system approach, and that's really one of the key messages of the safe system approach. It's really about a focus on fatal and severe injury crashes, and as a practitioner, a trade-off where accepting more minor crashes and the ability to reduce the fatal and severe injury crashes, that's a key principle of a safe system approach. So, yep, roundabouts continue to receive pushback, and of course some older drivers push back as well. But the safety benefits are even greater for older drivers.
Thank you, Mark. And now we decided we would ask you all a question. And I realize that there is no poll that we can pull up because this is an open-ended question. So instead, if you would throw some of your answers into the question pod for me, and I'll plan to read a few of those out. So we're looking for some feedback from you all as to what are some of the countermeasures that your agency is implementing for older driver safety. We had 3 fantastic speakers today who talked about the behavioral side, the planning side, and the infrastructure side. But we know that obviously in an hour and a half, we can't address everything. And we know you guys are doing some things that we didn't address today. So it would be fantastic if you would throw some of those again into the question pod for us. And I'll read some of those out here in a second for you all. Just a few things as we go ahead and wrap up and wait for some of those to come in. We have around 4 slides here that I mentioned of different resources that our speakers have put together for you. And you can download the PDF of this PowerPoint out of the handout pod over on the right-hand side. Again, I threw a few additional links into the chat pod that we had found beforehand, and also that some of our participants had provided us during today's webinar. So you can also copy those out of the chat pod. Additionally, I wanted to make sure that you all knew that the Road to Zero's Community Traffic Safety Grants applications are currently open right now. So you can go to nsc.org /Road to Zero to learn more about those grants. And then I'm going to leave you here on this slide. In case you have any additional questions and want to reach out to the Rural Road Safety Center, you can do that. And I'm going to go back and just spend the last couple of minutes mentioning a few of the things that are coming into the Q&A pod right now for what you all are doing. We have some information in here about Florida using a lot of education to help support benefits and use of roundabouts. And I did post a link earlier in the chat pod about what Florida is doing. Theirs is called the safemobilityfl.com website. So please go ahead and check them out. We'll put this again into the chat pod for you all if you're interested in learning more about their the work that they're doing and some of that roundabout education that was just mentioned for older drivers. We've also had someone mention that they're doing some car fit information and an annual online symposium, and they've had Mark also be one of their featured speakers. So that's fantastic that Mark is getting out there and talking a lot about older driver safety. We've had some other communities that partner with AAA and AARP to encourage attendance at senior driving classes. And also they help amplify those driving classes on their social media. A lot of people who are promoting the safe system approach. We do have a lot of information coming in about the car fit and having that available at some of the child car seat fitting stations as well. And then some information about doing roadway reflectivity for dusk and dawn for older drivers. So making sure that signs and pavement markings are reflective the way they should be to help with older drivers. And then as Mark mentioned earlier, that helps with all drivers as well. We have some going in here about people considering road diets in their area, and others that are doing some work on sign clutter reduction. And also making sure that the font sizes are appropriate for older drivers. We have some mention of wider edge lines and also some child passenger safety classes for grandparent caregivers. And while they're doing that, they also have some information about aging driver education curriculum that happens at that same time. And one last one about left turn traffic control. So all of those are fantastic, and thank you all for putting those in there. We're glad that you're able to go ahead and provide us some information about what you all are doing, as well as what our 3 presenters did today. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to Kathy, Kimberly, and Mark for their presentations. We hope that you have learned a lot about older driver safety, and happy Older Driver Safety Awareness Week to everyone. Have a great and fantastic week.